All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second to last book club before we break for summer break. I'm moderator Carmen. I am joining you tonight from Ottawa, where I've been doing government relations and advocacy for peace in Palestine and Israel for the last couple of days. I am on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. And I'm really, really thrilled tonight. One, that so many of you showed up. This is a different read than we've had for previous books in this book club. And maybe epic poetry is not for everyone, but I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm really happy to introduce you to Renee Sorogeny Cyclicar, who is the poet who wrote this epic poem. First in a series of epic poetry that will follow this storyline. And I will let her introduce herself a little bit more, but Renee is a lay member of the United Church of Canada. So I've been giving her sort of like, we have the 4 sort of centennial edition book clubs that start it after June when we kick off our centennial year. So we'll have a centennial United Church author sort of quarterly over the next year. But Renee is our 5th United Church author that we'll be reading over this 18-month period. And so very, very pleased that you could join us. And I'll invite you to share where you're joining us from. And if anybody else wants to type in their territorial acknowledgement into the chat, you're welcome to do that. And I will turn it over to Renee Sorogeny.
Thank you so much, Right Reverend Moderator Carmen. I am truly honored as the daughter of a United Church minister, as a lay member of what was Wilson Heights United, and now we're amalgamating with Oak Ridge United here in the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, East Van. I'm really, really thrilled, and I see a few faces from my United Church community here, and yeah, I'm really honored. So thanks for showing up and for selecting Bramah and the Beggar Boy, an epic fantasy in verse. And I know we're going to chat a bit about what that's all about.
Super. So you mentioned you're the child of a United Church minister. I believe it was your dad that was United Church minister. So just for my own church nerd history curiosity, where was your dad in ministry when you were growing up, or until he retired?
Yeah, so my dad, who was born in India, like I was, came to Canada in the 60s on a scholarship to Memorial University and had many different adventures, eventually decided to go into teaching. And he was teaching with the James Bay Cree and had a very significant experience. I won't get into those details now, but he actually converted to Christianity. And he and my mom was along this whole journey, and I was just a little baby. And it was just the 3 of us. My sister wasn't yet born. He got accepted to McGill University, and he was one of the first South Asians to be ordained in the Quebec Conference of the United Church of Canada. And in those days, the church sent you for the first 2 or 3 years, I think, after you were ordained. So we were in Montreal, and I can still remember as a very little girl poring over a map and not being able to pronounce the word Saskatchewan, because that's where we went for my dad's first series of charges. And you know, he had the whole 90-mile drive on a Sunday type of situation in the Carrot River area, and then down eventually in Canistino, PA, Melville area, and then down to Yorkton, Melville area where we were at Grenfell. And then eventually we came to New Westminster, where he ministered for many, many years, and sadly died just a few months after his retirement, almost 22 years ago now. And my late mother, who died in September 2022, and I'm still really sort of going through that grief cycle, but she was with him the whole journey, and what a journey it was. She came from a Muslim background. My dad came from a Hindu background. They converted to Christianity, and the church and the life of the church really was what I was brought up on. And I just want to give a shout out to a very dear friend who is also a PK. Ian Knipe has joined us, and his father was a legend. He and his father and his mother, Kay and Bernie Knight, were legends in the BC Conference, as it was then known. And of course, knew my parents really, really well. So yeah, that's kind of my United Church story. And for years I've been going with my husband. Okay, big reveal. My husband is, let's say, a health hero and works in government. And we've been members of Wilson Heights United, but now we're amalgamating with Oak Ridge United. So yeah.
If you didn't pick up on that big clue, her husband is Health Minister Adrian Dix for the government of British Columbia. So
Yeah, it's an easy Google. I don't hide
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Don't hold it against me. He's a huge supporter of my creative work. I honestly could not have done this in the pandemic without him. So yeah, sadly he wanted to join, but he's up with Indigenous folks in Comox Courtney today, doing some good work there. Yeah.
Super. So I had sent you a few questions in advance, as I normally do, just to sort of let you know where my brain was at. And I'm going to ask you the first one first, because I had some initial feedback that this was a technically difficult read, and some folks really struggled through it. And so just in case that, I mean, and I will admit, like, I read a very broad, I mean, you can tell from my book club, I read a very broad cross section of things, like everything from Noam Chomsky and Derrida to, romance novels. And there were parts where I had to like reread it and kind of make sense of what was happening. So I'm wondering if you can sort of like introduce the concept of a poem, like what is happening here, and maybe just give like the too long didn't read version for maybe folks who didn't get through it, or just really struggled to make sense of the actual plot through the poem.
Sure thing. My pleasure. I'm actually going to screen share. Let's try it and see if it works. Okay. Can everyone see that? I'm going to
I
make.
think you might have to do the same thing, like cancel the navigation panel
Yeah.
on the left-hand side, and then just make the font a bit bigger, especially probably for our friends in Jasper who are watching it on big screen.
Yeah.
There we go. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. So I've prepared a few little notes to address this very thing. And if you bear with me, I'm just, for our audience, for ourselves, just to center us, I'm going to begin with the very first words that you probably saw when you opened the book. And again, I'm so honored that you would. And I might just be moving this around as I read. So here we go. Introduction of the story. One afternoon, in an old house in an abandoned village on the outskirts of Perimeter in the place they call Pacifica, Bramah and the Beggar Boy find fragments of an ancient text in an oak box. Hunched over scraps of parchment and broken computer disks, they blow the dust off a cover, and so our story begins. So welcome to this world of Bramah and the Beggar Boy, book 1 of an epic fantasy and verse series that I am writing. There's actually another book out now. It is about climate change and social justice. And Bramah and the Beggar Boy features a hero, Bramah, a time-traveling locksmith, who's also a demigoddess, but she doesn't fully understand her origins. Now, you may look at her name and think, oh, that's like the Hindu god Brahma, but actually she's named after what is quote unquote the father of locksmithing, Joseph P. Bramah, which is a Wikipedia find later if you're interested. So she's an apprentice locksmith. She's a time traveler. I'm going to break it down, like what is epic, what is fantasy, etc. But in a snapshot, she's here. She's brown, brave, and beautiful. She's helping seed savers, scientists, resistors, and street orphans, i.e. the Beggar Boy and other kids like him, to battle the evil Consortium on a planet Earth ravaged by accelerated climate change. That's the context. So what makes it epic? Well, it's long, as you probably have experienced. It's long, there's many events and characters, and it deals with some big themes. I'm going to actually stop the screen share for a bit so you can just see me. And I've got the same notes here. I just wanted you to really see that so that you really felt, okay, what is she reading and how is this coming about? So I said it's epic, so it's long with many events and characters. And there's fantasy, magic, time travel, shape-shifting, and the supernatural. Now, I think we're going to talk about this in a bit, but these supernatural magic, time travel, fantasy, all that sort of stuff, you know, you may have noticed there's an oak box that has these magic properties. There's something called a chalice, which is actually a dystopian word for pieces of a microscope that these folks in the far future are trying to figure out. There's embedded stories, but all of this is infused with faith elements, and they're there. And one of the key elements of faith is the hero's motto, let all evil die and the good endure. And that continues throughout the whole series. Let all evil die and the good endure. And so what is evil? How is it defined? Thinking of our moderators' meetings today with the events in the Middle East, how is evil defined? Is it individual? Is it systemic? Is there state violence? Is there individual violence? And what is the good? So Bramah, our hero, our anti-hero's motto is let all evil die. You'll find it right in the front of the book. And the good endures. So what is the good? And what endures? And I think a lot of my impetus, which I do believe is a gift God-given, to write this massive work that some people are going to get and other people aren't, and it's all okay. I believe I'm writing something that will withstand the test of time. I feel spirit driven on that. And I often say I am making a work, hopefully, that feels like when you go into a maker's workshop, a potter or a quilter or a fabric artist or a carpenter, and you feel the power of their craft and skill, and you're kind of like awestruck. Even if you don't get all of it, you're not really understanding everything, you're looking, wow, this is so complex, this is so layered, this is so intricate. You know, when you go in an art gallery, even a folk art, like I'm thinking of, I love fabric arts and I write about it actually, even though I don't practice it, a really intricate quilt, like the Raja quilt that was woven by Australian and English convicts deported to Australia. And it's one of the most famous quilts in the world in a museum in Australia. And so you have this sense of awe and wonder. That's what I'm hoping this book will ultimately produce in its entire form. So I'm now working on book 3 of the series. Let all evil die and the good endure. Like that.
All right. Is the third book the final book?
Nope.
All right.
And again, God willing and the stars kindly and my own health and my own life, like hopefully I'm going to survive to finish it. I'm currently working on the 3rd book. So the first book that you've been so beautifully engaging with, thank you, is Bramah and the Beggar Boy. But there's a 2nd book that came out all during the pandemic in 2023, last year in August. And it's called Bramah's Quest. So there are 2 big books produced and published beautifully by BC's own independent literary press, Nightwood Editions. The 3rd one is called Bramah's Discovery. So we go Bramah and the Beggar Boy, Bramah's Quest, and Bramah's Discovery, which I'm working on currently. And there's 2 or 3 more planned, but we'll see. Well, if I can just get this 3rd book out, I'll be happy.
All right. Yeah, probably one book at a time.
Yep, poem at a time.
So, like, I remember being in English literature in high school and like reading parts of epic poems or a couple of epic poems over the course of like senior high school, especially. But like most of the poetry that I have encountered in my adult life has been like anthologies of poetry or like a collection of a poet's work. And so, like, what inspired you to write these epic poems? Because it kind of feels like, and I don't like, I will say I'm not a huge reader of poetry. Like I know Susan Alexander, who's another BC poet, but actually I gave her a copy of your book for her birthday when it first came out. So but and you know, I knew Lorna Crozier and her late husband, and you know, went from going to UVic, but like epic poetry doesn't seem like it's often done by most poets. And so what inspired you to write epic poetry?
Okay, I love this question. Thank you. And that's so honoring. And thank you for gifting my book. That's incredible. So I think the fundamental thing is I love story. And I think a lot of people experience poetry these days. They pick it up and they go, I don't know what this means. There's nothing I can connect with. I wanted to merge big themes, big ideas, let all evil die and the good endure, into characters and story. Maybe it's my South Asian heritage, but I like sagas of all kinds, whether it's Tolkien, like it's epic fantasy, right? So Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, the traditional epics of the Arabian Nights, the Hindu, the Mahabharata, or Finnish folktales that inspired, and Scandinavian Viking stories. I think story is embedded in our DNA, and I love those big epic Dr. Zhivago kind of situations. So I wanted some of that, Warren Beatty's Reds, you know, I wanted politics, climate change, global, local injustice, pandemic. I didn't know there was going to be a pandemic when I was researching the book. It took me 10 years to get to book one. And as I was, you correctly said, doing the finishing touches, like the world caught up with my imagination. But I think I wanted a vehicle, a container. Celebrated Canadian poet Sharon Thiessen talks about the epic poem is usually practiced by men, usually white men, and Milton, Chaucer, etc. And as far back as Homer, Virgil. And it's these broad brush, broad stroke canvases in which you have lives lived of individual characters and you start to care about the characters. Will Penelope go with the suitors, or will she stick with her returning husband? When is he ever coming home? Ulysses. So I guess as a woman of color, I wanted to step up. I wanted a chance to show my chops and actually give readers a big story that they could root for heroes, good and evil, and contemplate who is the good, who is the evil. And poetry, to me, is the way epics communicate beyond words. So hopefully in some of the poems I've chosen that we'll maybe get to in this conversation, there's a lot of rhyme in this book. I heard over the years that, you know, people say, oh, I just like poetry that rhymes. I don't get all this modern poetry. Actually, there's a ton of rhyme in this book. There's a ton of character building. I'm trying to bring the novel and verse through epic forms merged together. Yeah.
Interesting. I never thought about it when I was reading it, but I did come to care for the characters, right? Like I really, really was interested in Dr. Abigail, and then when it starts to become like, oh yeah, she doesn't survive, like that was heartbreaking. And then like every time I saw the name of like the village spy come up, I'm like, you.
Yeah.
So like, you know,
Yeah.
like she sort of became like this traitor in my mind, I guess, and I didn't really think about that as I was trying to piece them all together.
Oh,
Um,
that's amazing.
you shared a little bit about your father's journey in ministry, but I'm wondering if you and you know, let all evil die and the good endure, and you've talked about like your own sense of vocation and spirituality that sort of poured into this book. So can you talk a little bit about the way that your faith has influenced, like why you chose these things to write about?
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. I'm really honored by this question, and I thought a lot about it while I was creating this book. I guess the phrase I'd like to share with all of you is that my faith is like a creative faith infusion. So the key word is infusion. I hope that my work never is didactic. There are lots of people who don't have faith or identify as humanistic or agnostic or atheist. And hopefully my books will really speak to them. But I am a person of faith. There's no doubt about it. And I hope I have steeped the world building, the characters, especially this character, Dr. Abigail Ellen Anderson, who then adopts an orphan girl and names her, gives her her name Abigail. And so part two is about Abigail and Bartholomew and the child that they have, which takes you to the very end of the book. And then the beginning of the book, you meet Auntie Maria. She's what the Seed Savers called a bread breaker. And there are a few poems there where she actually actively gives communion, but it's kind of hidden and infused in the poetry. And there's a lot of poetry in there, but one day, maybe if you ever dip back in, you'll find the communion poems. And so my faith and the works of the gospel, understanding the Jesus impulse through matriarchs like Auntie Maria and Auntie Agatha, who are prominent in the book. They're mendicants, they're well-wishers, they're healers. And the work of Dr. Abigail Anderson, and I'm just gonna, is really key, and I think really illustrative of sacrifice. Like it's it's a old-fashioned word. And then maybe it'll be time to maybe read a poem, a couple poems. But I just wanted to share So we have this plot summary, and I just wanted to point out, I'm talking about Auntie Maria, the seed saver, who helps a group of outlawed scientists, including Dr. A.E. Anderson, Abigail Ellen Anderson. So this is me, a racialized writer, writing about a white woman. And I want to tell you something very specific about her, which I'm going to show you in this chronology I have. And she has a connection to the women of the Wishing Well, including Auntie Maria's sister, Auntie Agatha. And then Dr. Anderson, unfortunately, is incarcerated by the evil Consortium, which is a global mega agricultural, economic, scientific mega corporation, sends people to outer space, but can't feed children, you know, maybe it sounds a bit familiar. And the really bad guy is the investigator. So Dr. Anderson helps a band of beggar children, and she adopts one of them, a little girl, Auntie Agatha. So the issue of adoption and healing and love against powers, this is my faith infusion. And I think the actions of the characters speak for themselves. One of the things that happens in this book that people either pick up on, but is really carefully plotted, is that Bramah, as this hero rescuer, only shows up when the characters decide to sacrifice. At moments of sacrifice, there could be a bit of Gandalf and Tolkien there. That's when Bramah appears, right? So I just wanted to point out in the book, and hopefully this is helpful. When you open the book, that little bit I read about they're crouched in that farmhouse at the edge of perimeter and their Bramah blows the dust off a cover, that's in the far future. And the book starts here. And of course, then we're in the farmhouse. There's all this world building. I'm going to probably read you a poem that introduces you to Bramah and the world. And then the parchments are a series of stories that are embedded within that frame tale. And that leads you to the story of the year 2020. What was happening then in our life? And look what we see. Dr. Abigail Ellen Anderson is born during the year 2020. I wanted the first real life, non-supernatural character the readers meet to be born during a pandemic. And I'd already been plotting that and planning that, and then it happened. That's pretty freaky. Fate, karma, divine will, who knows? I do feel spirit-driven in this creation. So she's born in a biocontagion, and during her growing up years, when she's 10 years old, things start to go really, really bad. And I'm going to read a poem about that as well. Just these poems are very short. So there's a series of 5 eco-catastrophes that just destroy the world, and Consortium takes over. And then there's this epic battle of Kingsway. We probably won't get into that, but I wrote it for all my East Van peeps because I live just down from Joyce and Kingsway. Kingsway is like an iconic place in our unceded territories. And then 2057, things get really bad. And by then, our dear Dr. Anderson is, big spoiler, she has been executed by Consortium, but just in the nick of time, because she has sacrificed and saved this orphan girl and given her name. So the idea of adoption and the giving of names, powerfully influenced by many cultures, I think, including our indigenous cultures. So Bramah rescues Abigail, the daughter of Dr. Anderson. And the story then continues and ends in 2087 when, spoiler alert, even Abigail does not survive, but she lasts long enough to birth a child, Raphael, who will then meet in book 2. So that is this big whoop story. And maybe, is it time for me to read a couple poems, maybe?
Sure, I would love that. I know when we were waiting for folks to gather, Alan had mentioned that they're excited to hear you read it and to hear the poetry in your voice, the way that it was intended, like the way that you wrote it, as opposed to the way we might read it in our own minds and in our own voices.
Yeah, well,
like even the way you're like Bramah blows the dust off the cover, like, you know, like I would never have thought to like make that blowing sound as I read it in my mind. So I'm looking forward to hearing you read.
All right, how lovely. So I'm not gonna screen share it. So just so you can, you know, I'll be looking down a little. So I am reading from page 10. So this is the first real introduction to Bramah. I've combined a lot of operatic and stagecraft in addition to novel techniques. I wanted you to meet these village gossips, these ladies, the oracles, all the stuff you meet. So there's 10 pages before you meet Bramah. And that's like a screen technique where you hear about the character before you meet them. And now page 10, the summons, Bramah on a job. It's really important to me. She's a worker. She's a laborer. She's an apprentice locksmith, woman in a non-traditional world. Every siren and perimeter sounded an alarm. On that day, arrival. Although no one knew who they were, small woman with a boy, Bramah and the Beggar Boy. She from around here? Asked the settlers one by one. Their voices even-toned, their eyes stone cold. You know that look, right? That stone cold settler look. Are you from here? Where are you from? So I'll go back into the poem. Their voices even-toned, their eyes stone cold, gaze fixed on Bramah's well-oiled leather satchel. Usurpers. What response might they expect? Settlers at perimeter's edge, they wait. Bramah's slant smile, radiance as a foil, under her brown hands hidden from sight, her pip and file, her keys and her drill, codes, spells, chants to unlock any treasure. Street beggars, boys with brooms, girls with swords, from their bruised mouths, parched lips, masks torn away. Until the rains arrive and we survive, wash your hands, use your sleeve. Trust us now, you'll never have to grieve. At the 5th gate, transport drivers lounged, troop guards to inspect, their hands to scrounge. Bramah on contract, face smooth as silk. The Beggar Boy trailing behind that last drop of milk. Yeah, so hopefully there you heard rhyme. You heard the tools of a blacksmith, pip and file, keys and drill. But of course it's epic fantasy, so she's got codes, spells, and chants. She's a contract worker. She's hired to make things and break them, break open vaults. She's arrived at this planet Earth. Perimeter is a kind of concept for the way Consortium apartheid's resistors and survivors in this dystopian universe. We all know settlers. We can be settlers. And it's a very complex relationship when we're settlers to the land we live on and the indigenous peoples. And Bramah is a settler herself. They're all settlers because they're all on someone else's land. And then you hear this little fragment, totally rhyming. And doesn't it evoke what we lived through? Until the rains arrive and we survive, because it's about climate change as well over the whole series. Wash your hands, use your sleeve. Whoa, where did we hear that? Trust us now, you'll never have to grieve. I was actually commissioned by the Museum of Surrey during the pandemic to collaborate with an artist. And we made masks. Well, the museum made these beautiful masks and they imprinted these lines on the outside of the mask. Yeah, so that's our first introduction to Bramah. And I chose 2 more poems, but I just wondered, Carmen, did you have any thoughts, discussion? Do you want me to get into it? I didn't want to just barrel through, just wanted to pause.
No, well, I mean, I definitely think I hear the rhyme, like when you read it, especially when you read it, I hear the rhyming more than I did when I read it.
Yep.
Because it's not the like, what's it like, pentic diameter or whatever, like where it's all like evenly spaced out in terms of syllables and stuff like in Shakespeare or but I do hear it, and I wonder if it would help, like if there's parts I dive back into later where I like if I read it out loud to myself, right?
Oh,
like
what a wonderful thing. Yes.
If that might make it easier to pick up on. But I know that there's 2 other poems that you wanted to share with us. So
should I just
do that? Because do it.
Okay. So, and we can always dovetail in and out depending on time and everything else. So I thought what you were saying though, I'll just circle back. Actually, a lot of this is written in an iambic pentameter, which is the sort of epic form of Shakespeare. But iambic pentameter is usually not rhymed. And you absolutely nailed it. A lot of poetry that's rhymed, and that's why we kind of frown on it now, is really effective for memory, but it's kind of roses are red, violets are blue. And so all the rhymes happen at the end of the line and they're exactly the same. And they have this kind of da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I do a little bit of that, lounge and scrounge, milk and silk. but I kind of weave it in so that you don't feel like you're kind of been lectured to with this kind of rhymey, right? You can come at it the way you want. All right. So this climate change world is a big, big part of why I felt driven to write this. And so this is a poem on page 42 called The Five Catastrophes. It's a very simple poem with a lot of symbolism. Here it goes. The Five Catastrophes. By water, the soul, tsunami, seepage, cascading, eroded. By fire, the eyes, scorched, singed, blasted, burned to melt. By earth, the body, trembling, split, collapsed on knees, tumbled and crushed. By wind, the voice, blown, sifting syllables, winnowed circumference, made square by four. Ripped, torn, worn, howl. It were the Battle of Kingsway and after. And then if you got the book, there's that big symbol, the hexagon, which frequents throughout the book. And it has this sort of mystic symbolism for me. You know, it's the symbol of the bees. But there you can see the symbolism of 5 ecological catastrophes blended with the body. Water in the soul, fire in the eyes, earth in the body, the knees trembling, wind and the voice blowing sifted syllables. And then made square by 4 is like the 4 corners of the earth. And then this ripped towel, torn, worn out, that's the sound of, you know, when there's hurricanes and terrible winds and everything. And this Battle of Kingsway, which will be coming up again and again throughout this series, is like this epic battle of good and evil. And I wanted to set an epic in the locale in which I lived. So often we think of these epics as foreign or, you know, these exotic places. I wanted to create an epic for the working people and for ordinary people right here in my East Van community.
Yeah, that was one of my sort of like small detail questions, because I also I'm in Ottawa at the moment, but I think all of you know that I live in Coquitlam, British Columbia, previously North Van. And so I was like, okay, Pacifica, Kingsway, like those are obviously nods to like Metro Vancouver, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I thought maybe we could have a little bit of discussion and then I'll end with the last poem that really gets into this character, Dr. Abigail Anderson, and really illustrates, it's bleak, it's trigger warning, it's heavy, but it illustrates sort of, I think, my connection, not just to climate change, but to justice and equity, social justice issues happening the world over. I wrote this in, well, I wrote it over a series of years, but I really honed the poems in this book during the pandemic. I had really started editing it. I'd been working on it for 10 years. I started editing it in 2019. I really honed it in 2020 and it came out in 2021. So well before, for instance, Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the terrible events of the Hamas hostage kidnapping, and then the ongoing, since 1947, terrible, terrible oppression of the Palestinian people and the invasion now of Gaza and Rafah. So when I get to the final poem I'll read today, I think you'll feel where I'm going with a lot of that. But I wanted to dovetail back to this question. Maybe I'll read the poem and then we'll talk about like where is the hope.
Yeah.
And yeah. So should I just go ahead with this poem? All right.
Do it.
So this is this character that came to me very late in my creative process, Dr. Abigail Ellen Anderson. And people have asked me, is she modeled after Dr. Bonnie? Maybe just very, very tangentially, but not really. She's an amalgam of strong Caucasian women that I admire in my life. And as a racialized writer, as a brown woman, I wanted to write a really great white woman character. And I wanted to make her a doctor, a scientist. And, you know, this book is about seed saving and resistors and rebellion against the evil consortium, but it is not anti-science. It is not freedom convoy. It is not anti-vaccination. I just got to put that right out there for you. So here it is. Trigger warning is a very sad poem, and it is a sonnet, and it is roughly iambic pentameter, so kind of roughly 10 beats to a line. The good doctor witness to the fate of children. I refuse to stop posting health records. Premature babies, their third eye bulging. I'm reading from page 70 of the book. Consortium banned all clinical trials. One by one, the beggar children lined up. They thought cooperation meant hot meals. Trembling, blood spattered, I wrote out their words. My eyes filled with tears. That was the moment, I told them later. They looked up and smiled. Shadow walker, my hair plaited with smoke, ash biscuits on my tongue, dissolving grief. Left to die in the middle of the road. This they repeated just under their breath. Will they come for us? The children asked me. My gaze steady, I told them only death. Outside, sword girls sighed, derisive in chains. IED, baby, IED, your bombs, our arms. Boom.
That is heavy. I don't know if I've talked about this with folks in the book club before, but I have like a really deep and probably almost unhealthy obsession with like dystopian dystopian anything, like novels, movies, um and like it really has that sort of like Book of Eli, like end of days, orange skies, like everything's been scorched earth kind of feel to it. um and then probably I didn't like read this much into it, but after spending kind of like 2 days talking about Israel and Palestine, the IED, baby, IED, your bombs are arms, boom. And I remember back to like 2006, 2007, when there was like those skirmishes between Israel and Lebanon and the cluster bombs that Israel was sending into Lebanon, and our partner churches talking to us about like, you know, kids running out to go play in the field after the bombing had stopped. But of course, the bombing doesn't stop with cluster bombs. And there's like like the intersection between like childhood and the impacts of climate and the impacts of war on childhood, um, like stands out to me in this poem too.
Yeah, and it's for children all over the world that suffer. One of the continuing lines that comes up is not only IED, improvised explosive devices, and that was really inspired by my research into children in Afghanistan, actually, but also like the world over, right? In our own country, who is it that suffers most? It's impoverished people, working people, children. Children become the battering ram, the front workers, frontline experiencers of climate change and social injustice and war and violence. Whether they're kidnapped by terrorists, my aunt and uncle were murdered in a terrorist incident. So I feel that very poignantly, that justice calls us to really examine all sides of violence. And Bramah is against violence. Let all evil die and the good endure. And in this poem, that you hear this fragment, and the fragment is actually longer, and it comes up in the rest of the book where they say, not only IED, baby, these children are chanting, IED, baby, you can just picture them right outside these war scenes. IED, your bombs, our arms, boom. It also goes on to, we just want it. Freedom fighter terrorist, who's right, who's wrong? We just want to eat. Been so long. That's the full refrain. And that's, I think, a really important part of my visioning and my faith infusion, that none of us are left off the hook, you know. I think Jesus calls us to witness for all people who suffer. And so it gets complex. And It maybe leads to questions, and I just thank you for your reaction because it's so honoring. Writing this was hard, but my characters always gave me hope. And surely that's spirit given, that in moments, the bleakest moments, somehow I always found characters who were willing to sacrifice for others. And that keeps me going. And throughout this saga, there are always not a lot, and really terrible things happen. Without a doubt, it is dystopian epic fantasy. So things are really, really bad. But there are always these glimmers of characters, particularly Bramah and others who cluster around her, who are willing to sacrifice, to make a difference, to save seeds at all costs. Yeah, and there's hope in that, right? As long as there's even a few people, one or two people, one person, two people to sacrifice, there's hope.
So you alluded to this a little bit, but I mean, in terms of the world catching up to your imagination, but like for real, to work on researching and then drafting this book for 9 years, and then in your 10th year working on it, like not only do we face this global pandemic, but you're married to the Minister of Health.
Yeah.
So I imagine that like all of the considerations of what that, you know, because like in your household, you're not only caring for yourself, your mother, your family, but also your husband has this massive responsibility as a, you know, somebody who's called to service in our provincial government to try and like make hard decisions with at the time like very little information. And so what was that like for you to finish this book in that context when you'd been writing about some of these, and we had like bad forest fires that year too, I think in
Big
2020.
time. Big time. We had the heat dome, like it all happened.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say I feel such gratitude and such honor. You're the moderator of my church, and here you are expressing such kindness and compassion. Thank you. It's a blessing to hear your words, and it's really healing, actually, to be able to have this conversation. It was surreal. So what that experience was like, it was surreal. It was frightening. It was unsettling. It was disturbing. I felt very Cassandra-like. I felt like, if I think it, will it happen? Like it was very freaky, but also ultimately inspiring because my husband somehow found the time. We were locked down. We were our bubble of two when he wasn't in Victoria with Dr. Bonnie, when we were just in our own little bubble. He would read everything and he would give me excellent feedback. He's just been amazing. And that really helped me going. He was my first reader. There was nobody else. And my dear mom, who was in care, and you know, for a long time I couldn't see her. I would have chats with her. The care workers would do the Zoom, and we'd have these Zoom chats, and I would talk to her about the book and the characters, and was able eventually during the pandemic to see her and to give her a copy of the book. She claims to have read it, but I don't think she did. Yeah, so the hope is in people, right? In people choosing, as you beautifully said, thank you, to look after the greater good, to sacrifice. And we all did, I thought, ultimately, for all the problems, for all the things that happened, especially in those pre-vaccine days, we pulled together, we looked after one another. And if human beings can do that for ourselves and for the planet, for living things, save seeds, look after plants and animals, maybe we have a fighting chance. There's always a choice. And I think faith-based, that faith infusion, my faith infusion in my work is there's always a choice to be cynical, to be dark, to be angry, to be violent, to be shouty. That raises a lot of interesting questions for if we choose to be activists and protesters, which is honorable, but you know, you got to think about some things there. So we can do those things, or should we be makers? You know, makers, seed savers. And what happens if the world pivots from thinking and doing, which is important, but brings in making and being? And that is so much of this. If there's a message embedded underneath all of that, it's about the people who are kind of the good characters tend to be people who make things.
interesting that you sort of characterize like the shoutiness and like contrasting that with why I'm here in Ottawa. And we have, a whole spectrum from like almost Christian Zionist, definitely like aligned with state of Israel, to like very, very pro-Palestinian, across the United Church. No congregation, no community of faith is homogeneous in how
Yes.
they feel. And we have had some very long-term strident voices that have been trying to seek justice for Palestine. And now that I think that there's these like additional security concerns for Israelis, um, those voices are coming out strong too across Canadian society. And one of the so I got confronted by a parliamentarian today about the United Church having been too shouty, and to the point like where if we want to be effective, maybe we could take a step back and let like Bishop Susan lead for the Lutheran Church or something like that, sort of like
Okay.
kind of settle under her wing a little bit, just because we've maybe damaged some relationships by being too shouty.
Mhm.
But also hearing from diplomats that work in the mission in the Palestinian territories, coming home and not being prepared for how vitriolic and heightened the emotions are on both sides
Yes.
about what's happening in Gaza, compared to what it's like to be living in Israel and the occupied territories, right? So like they're like, yes, people are angry on both sides, yes, people are scared, they don't like, but they're also like getting up and going to work or sending their kids to school. And like this is a 77-year-old 76-year-old conflict, that like this is the most recent spate of like violence, but also life goes on, and this is just like they live through it, and they have like a lot more almost like emotional resilience or emotional intelligence about all of the things, like all of the propaganda coming on both sides. And then these diplomats come home from that context to Canada, where everybody's like, "Ah," and their heads are
Yes.
popping off, and they're like, whoa, like you guys don't even live there.
Yes.
But
It's very strange.
they also don't have access to like the lived realities of what it is to go through that right now. And they're only seeing like what our algorithms can kind of predict them to see. And we know, or we're starting to know more, the way that predictive algorithms sort of like increase polarization, um,
Freedom
curate for
fighter,
us.
freedom fighter, terrorist, who's right, who's wrong? We
Yeah.
just want to eat. It's been so long. That's where I'm coming from. I
Yeah.
have suffered terrorism, not personally, but my aunt and uncle were murdered by people who chose to put bombs in planes for their ideals. And I will never, ever accept that violence is an answer, whether it's state-based violence or individual acts of
Yeah.
violence. Um, that's, yeah. And these books try and really straddle these very difficult um, situations. And I think as a poet, I feel this faith infusion obligation to be real clear, let all evil die and the good endure. And then the reader has to kind of figure out like, where are they on that? And
Yeah.
my pitch is, what if we were more makers and being rather than shouters and choosing destruction and violence? In my second book, I get much more explicit about that, but this is the book we're looking at. And in this book, it's about people who are choosing to go more holistically rather than, yeah, that kind of shouty activism ain't my bag.
Well, when we open it up to discussion with other folks in the book club, it'll be interesting to hear. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, folks, about
Yeah.
like contrasting this book with last month's book, which I don't know, Renee Sarojini, if you've read it, is A Psalm for the Wild Built
Mm.
by Becky Chambers. It's a little novella, and it's really lovely, but it almost is like the manifestation of that world where people just become makers and don't choose violence anymore and have a much simpler lifestyle. And it's like 1,000 years into the future. So
Oh, wow. I must
yeah,
get this
so I'm
book.
gonna
I
Yeah.
must get this book.
And it is also the first in a series of books about the interactions between robots in the future and humans after they've been separated for 1,000 years. Because
Okay.
the robots are like, you guys are creating too much, like we don't like the world you're creating, and so we're like, peace out, we're going to go live in the woods, and left humans to fend for themselves.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, I like your choices.
Okay, last question I had for you is just
Yeah.
what messages are you hoping that church readers would take away from this book?
I guess that dovetails really nicely. I guess I've been going towards that. Yeah. So my mantra is that if we can get into a maker mode rather than thinking and doing, so making and being rather than thinking and doing. Thinking and doing is important, but making and just being, maybe we'll be gentler with ourselves and others. Maybe we'll find more compassion. Maybe we'll start thinking about saving seeds, literally and also metaphorically, right? There's a lot of symbolism. A preacher man at VST once shared with me the following: hope does not secure the present, it enlarges the future. And if my book can, for faith-infused people, can be anything, I hope through the actions of Bramah, Dr. Anderson, Abigail, and Auntie Maria, the bread breaker who does communion and saves seeds, aligns herself with scientists, even as a maker, isn't anti-science. These are, I'm hoping these are the seeds of hope.
Thank you. Alan, I wonder if we can open it up to other folks to get their impressions, or maybe you have questions, maybe things make more sense and you want to share like some aha moments that have come up for you as you've heard Renee Sarojini as the poet talk about her work. Um,
So just a reminder, folks, if you want to put up your digital hand for me, it makes it easier to find you, and I'll ask you to unmute and we can hear your questions.
Might need to just process.
yeah, I'm usually okay with a few minutes of silence to let people go.
Totally. Just process.
I see Sandra. And Sandra, do you want to share where in the country you're joining us from?
I'm on Benwas Island in Nova Scotia, which, so-called Nova Scotia, which is the land of the Mi'kmaq people, and they did not cede it to a settler like me. Thank you. I have so appreciated hearing your voice, because it does change how one processes what is being said. I share in a way your hope about people being makers and doers. I'm someone in the United Church who is very concerned about justice issues, and I'd like some help in translating being someone who is making and being, and yet reacting to the kinds of things that Carmen has been talking about, and even in the context of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my concern might be that if we are beers, if we are making and being, are we perhaps ignoring the justice stuff? So I'd like to hear you speak to that, please.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm honored with your thoughtful, important question. I guess my short answer, like my most authentic short answer, is I'm not sure. I see these two polarities as on a continuum, and I would never not want to have thinkers and doers. You need them big time. But sometimes when we skew a lot to the head, to a male model of thinking, doing, we forget about a more femme-centered, matriarchal being and making. And I guess that's the only way I can put it, that I want to tilt back, bring back a balance between those things. As a poet, as someone who's known as a kind of experimental poet, difficult poetry, that kind of thing. In my world, in academia, there's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of polarization. As a brown woman, especially on some of the issues going on in the world right now, I feel like there's a lot of this sort of righteous anger and kind of white liberal guilt. And it's like, okay, what if we just, like at our Indigenous Center, very committed to social activism. But, you know, one of the ongoing things that I've just appreciated is we do beading together. We do crafts together. And we park all the stuff on the side and we make together. And it isn't about, you're quite right, like it taken to its nth degree, it would become a kind of reductive idiocy if we were just making and being, that yeah, 10 days for world development, the whole history of the United Church wouldn't exist. So absolutely, you have to have all of that. But I guess I'm just, especially when it comes to climate change, this idea of not shaming and blaming. And as a creative writing instructor, one of my phrases in class is always about, you know, people come late, they don't do the work. It's not good. I'm not excusing it, but there's no use in shaming and blaming. And I have never known anyone, by the way, thinking of our wonderful moderator, and heart out to you, moderator, for what you've been going through the past few days. I've never known anyone to change their mind because someone shouted at them. Did you? Like maybe a mom, like, stop that, fire. Okay, yes. Get your hand away from that. Okay. But for complex things involving one's moral sense of code and what is right and wrong, does anyone change by being shouted at? And this isn't popular. This is not a popular position amongst my peers. I think a lot of 20, 30-year-old, I'm quite a bit older, see protest as going and marching and shouting, and I do not. They also serve who only stand and wait, as blind poet Milton said. Yeah, I really, really appreciate the question.
I think there's also, for me, in your vision of being and making more, and maybe like the thinking and doing less, is also that like climate change is really driven by our consumerism, right? Like we are consumers of movies, of clothes, of like bigger cars than we need. I mean, maybe not so much in the United Church, but you know, I think we have and I see, as I travel across the country, a lot of people trying to make the most ethical choices that they can. So like supporting independent bookstores rather than the big A, and you know, choosing to drive hybrids or plug-in hybrids or EVs, like depending on what's best for the context where they are. Listening to me when I tell you, if you live in Alberta, that Tesla is not the best option when you have coal-powered electricity. It's actually worse than driving a car. But you know, like so much of our economic growth is driven by consumption. But like when you slow down, you live more simply. Like Alan is sort of like you remember in the movie Jerry Maguire where Cuba Gooding Jr. is like, you're my ambassador of Kwan, and like Kwan is the money, right? But like Alan is like my ambassador of like living in a way that is more in balance and like with what's enough, and like in a very values driven way. And I think, Alan, you're doing a lot of good ambassadorship in Banff to help people who want to protect our winters, who want to enjoy the outdoors, to really analyze like what their consumer spending looks like, both in a place that's hard to live in financially because of lack of affordable housing and things like that, but also because you make the connections between like the choices, the financial choices you make, and also what that means in terms of like supply chains and where everything we buy comes from, and trying to live gentler on the earth so you can continue to enjoy it. And so that's what I like when I hear you talk about that making and being, is like it's a like I grew up in a household where my mom jarred all our tomatoes and peaches and cherries and pears, and like made huge batches of spaghetti sauce and canned them for us, and like made homemade bread, and it was a lot of work. And she doesn't like me to tell that story because she says it makes it sound like we never shopped in a grocery store. My father was commercial fisherman, she's First Nations. Like we had access to a lot of seafood. We usually had 2 or 3 deep freezers. And I know that there are a lot of people across the country who are only like 1 or 2 generations sort of removed from homesteaders, the same as my dad is from his grandpa, who came from England. But like how many people my age are young? I mean, before the pandemic, when like homesteading became sort of in vogue again, but how before 2020, like how many people were actually like making their own pickles and stuff like that? Like it's requires more labor, but it is a gentler way to live on the earth, and to like keep all your mason jars and reuse them, and all of those things actually make a difference, and are a place to build community too, because normally we don't do those things alone.
Yeah, so wise.
Yvonne, I see your hand up, and you can also share where you're joining from tonight too.
I'm joining from Toronto.
Ah.
And I'm appreciating this conversation about being and making. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, and interesting to see it in an epic poem, which is certainly not my usual form of reading. But I think the being part takes us deeper, than the blame and the shame. I think often, as you said, that social action invites us sometimes to want to blame and shame one side. And to me, the being that you were talking about takes us deeper than that. And what is the issue here? Even in Israel, Palestine, or your story away into the future, the issue is the grief and the sorrow and the lack of peace. And to me, by being and getting beneath that, then it helps us figure out what we might do. There still is a place to do, but if we've taken time to be, it gives us an opportunity to think about doing in a different way with a different agenda.
I so appreciate you sharing that, Yvonne. I'm honored to be in community and discussion. Yeah, well, I mean, I know, like, intellectually, I can hear. I was trained as a lawyer, but I don't practice. You always hear the other side, and I thought, I just forget. Oh, Sandra raised a really good point about, you can take these little mantras, ideas, and reduce them to their sort of ridiculousness. So if it's just making and being, I don't think that's going to work that well. But yeah, it's about recalibration.
Mm-hmm.
And I love what you're saying about, to me, the being part goes to compassion, and compassion for ourselves and others, right? To suffer with, the Latin root of the word compassion, to suffer with. And Jesus shamed the moneylenders in the temple. You have made the house of worship, my father's house of worship, a place, a den of thieves. But he also loved his feet being washed by the so-called sex trade worker. I think this duality of compassion, and oh my goodness, it's so complex. I think of Northern Ireland. I think of India and Pakistan. I think of Ukrainians who are Russian speaking. We can go on and on in the world. Like, these are very complex, tough, divided, partitioned, small land, lots of people, separate histories, religion. And how can human beings find a way through history in a way that is just and equitable? I think we have have some really great role models for not picking up a gun and not shouting and not killing each other. What a tragedy that former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. What a terrible, terrible tragedy. I think there's some really, really good people who have ways of being in really high stakes, difficult situations and not giving in to the shame and blame. And
Mhm.
my book doesn't offer any answers to that. Otherwise, I don't think it'd be very good poetry, but it raises these questions, I think.
Mhm.
And the characters are deeply flawed. They make bad decisions all the time. And the book I'm working on right now, which I'm finding really hard, Bramah, you know, her motto is let all evil die and the good endure. How she comes to terms with that is going to be very, very complex in the book I'm writing. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
up till book 3, she's always taken the high ground. And maybe I'm influenced by what's going on in the world, but sometimes we are pushed to take a stance, but it always comes with a cost, right? So my North Star, my ground zero for me is, if we choose violence as an end, those that live by the sword will die by the sword. I have never seen anything that suggests otherwise.
Yeah.
And if you bomb Dresden and you defeat Hitler, or you bomb Nagasaki, there's a terrible cost. And you might need to do it, but there's a terrible cost.
Yeah.
So one of the things that distresses me about some of the dialogue with recent events world over is this sort of ahistorical approach, where people without a deep understanding of lives lived, of land, of geography, of complex cultures and history don't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite, but they're yelling about justice. I'm like, I just draw it right away. I just shut right down. I'm like, I don't want a part of that. I'm gonna go quilt.
Well, and I also think you're looking into the future in this writing, that, you know, maybe there are times for protest and there are times not to protest. Like with Martin Luther King, people were willing to make the sacrifice you talk about, and could somehow not give in to violence, even though they were confronted with so much of it. But perhaps we have to think about different ways of being and doing in the future, which I think you're kind of struggling with, that take us deeper. I actually think we're reacting against the idea of unity and of quantum physics, understanding everything as a part of everything else. This is, we still want to be dualistic. And I think you're inviting us to think more holistically, and that
wow.
changes protest very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow, I'll have to reflect deeply on that.
I was just thinking back to your question in the poem about who is terrorist, who is freedom fighter, right? Like that came up obviously a lot in this conversation that we're having with parliamentarians this week. And I'm here with, you know, Kairos Canada, the Mennonite Church Canada, Quakers, Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Anglican Church. And like either leaders or senior leaders or people, and some of our staffers as well. And you know, one of the parliamentarians tried to say, you know, like do the equals thing, like Hamas equals terrorist equals like Islam equals, you know, Palestinians equals, like, so like trying to like tar everybody with the same brush, and how like we don't negotiate with terrorists. And on the other side, you know, whether you say terrorist or whether you say resistance to oppression, one of my colleagues sort of said, you know, we say that, but now we recognize the governments of Ireland and South Africa and like all of these, like Israel itself, like the original armed conflicts before the settlement of the state of Israel. Like the US and Canada had classified those like armed Jewish settler groups as terrorists. But we, you know, like at what point do we recognize the legitimacy of the people who are leading and fighting for what they believe in, and like the indigenous person in me is like, don't recognize anybody who comes with guns trying to take land.
Yep. Yeah. I'm
And I
just not
realized
into the gun thing. Yeah.
and I realize it's, you know, especially complicated in the Holy Land because of the expulsion of the Jews, you know, thousands of years ago. And I've been having interesting conversations with indigenous cousins who are all of a sudden like the most engaged pro-Palestinian. Like they see the similarities in terms of settler colonialism and what they understand, which is very little, about the history in the Holy Land and the problem of religion and colonization and the European settler colonial roots of the current conflict. But I said to one of my cousins, one of the reasons why it's so complicated is at what point do we say that Jews don't have the right of return to the Holy Land, right? Like we've been over 500 years of suffering under colonization in North America. And so let's imagine that doesn't get resolved for another 1,000-1,500 years. Are we going to say that our homeland is not here?
Hmm.
If we want to stay here, like, which is, you know, there you can poke all kinds of holes in that too, but I do think that we are living in a very ahistorical moment where people are not nuancing some of these ethical questions and just getting shouty and positional.
Yeah.
And that's tough. Did you, I'm sure you guys saw the let me see if I can find it. The Daily Hive came out with like a report from the planetary policy thing. I can't remember what it was about, like the most likely threats and most impactful threats to life in British Columbia. Have you seen
No,
this?
I haven't seen it.
Let me see. I'll see if I can find it and throw it in the chat for you guys. But it's a Canadian think tank says that this is the most plausible threat to the country's future.
Oh,
And so they have listed the 10 most likely disruptions and the 10 highest impact destructions. So like the number one most highest impact destruction would be if there was another world war.
yeah.
But the top most likely disruption is people cannot tell what is true and what is not.
Aha. Aha. And
Here,
that
I found
raises
it.
really interesting issues for a poet working her imagination in epic fantasy, because I get asked that a lot about, you know, how do I experience truth if I'm creating this imaginary world? That gets very geeky into English lit. Thank you for that link. I look forward to looking at that and contemplating it. And I did want to bring it, if I may, away.
Yeah.
Oh, it's very, very important. And I have a lot of honor for people who have to roll up their sleeves and actually work out these issues. But I did want to also dovetail back to the climate change.
Yeah.
So much a part of this book. And how can we take care of the earth and ourselves? And do we have a place as humans, or have we blown it so badly that it's over for us? Because one of the things that I had to really grapple with in my research for this series was that there are very committed, fine thinking, good people in the ecology movement who believe that kind of the time for humans is gone. Like we've blown it so bad that it's time for us to be erased. Of course, I don't agree with that, but I wanted to intellectually, spiritually engage with how will humans actually survive and what kind of life will we live? And I was really taken, Carmen, with your evocation of your own background and you know, I'm not very crafty. My craftiness is with words. I wish I quilted. I like writing about quilting, and I'm kind of obsessed with kind of the way you are with dystopian things. I'm just very drawn to making, and I make with words. I'm not much of a cook anymore. There's lots of things I don't do. My sister's a great seamstress. I have my dear friend here. Ian, you're quite crafty in many ways, but I'm not. I write about bees, but I don't keep a bee hive, right? But this idea about how are we as humans going to actually be with scarce resources. And I loved what you said, that sometimes thinking and doing can make us rushed consumers. So we're always going for the easy convenience. And this book is about, once we've done that to the nth degree and the 5 catastrophes happen, if we don't smarten up, they may well. How are we going to be in community and relation with the land, with resources? And the characters in my book are always imperfectly struggling with that. And they usually come out on the side of making things and of salvaging things and rescuing things, and the right of repair, which is a whole movement, right? Where they have to repair things. And so I really wanted to infuse the world I was making through the poems with these characters who are doing that. Yeah. Aw. Amazing conversation. What an amazing book club.
Have you read, this is another good shout out for another book that didn't make my book club list, but do you know Lisa Bordeaux? She's another local Vancouver author. She works in the like climate change environment team at the city of Vancouver. She's an urban planner. And she wrote this sort of dystopian mystery novel called Adrift. So I just put the link to her website and the novel in there because it, so I belong to another book club that I started during the pandemic. And it's a whole bit like, I'm going to drop a whole bunch of BC names for folks that are like probably not in BC, but it's like Derek Parker from the Vancouver Foundation, William Azeroff from Brightside Community Housing, Jill Atke from BC NPHA, me, Jennifer Breakspear from BC Housing, Colin Phillips from Kindred Works, who some church folks will know was a nominee for Moderator in 2018 in Oshawa at GC43. Is an amazingly brilliant professor of social policy and social work at TMU in Toronto, but lives in Vancouver and lives with cerebral palsy and is nonverbal, but he's in my book club. And Susan Grossman from UBC, Shannon Rohan from SHARE, which is the Shareholder Association for Action and Research Education, who are the folks that we work with on shareholder advocacy with the United Church Pension, and they're also starting to do some work with the Vancouver Foundation. And so William and I founded this book club in my cousin Tova from Fathom AI, and then Maylene Ahoy, who is at Shayak Housing. We started this book club during the pandemic. It was called Books That Matter. And so we alternate fiction and nonfiction, but it always has to have a social justice theme. And Lisa actually came and talked to our book club a couple of months ago in Vancouver one night. And so it's into the future, and we're living through the impacts of climate change. And it's like this mystery novel, which I won't give any spoiler alerts about what the mystery was, but
Yeah,
we ultimately found it a fairly hopeful book because of some of the public policy changes that had happened to like govern how we were going to mitigate our existence through climate change. And so it's kind of like how if this is a bit of a spoiler alert, I've already told people to start reading A Ministry for the Future because it's 583 pages, and we'll read that at some point in the next year with Elizabeth May, who chose the book. She's going to be joining the book club, faithful Anglican and also member of Parliament and the leader of the Green Party. But like that book kind of switches from like this really horrific like climate catastrophe start to a more hopeful ending. And I do think that is like the question of the age, right? Like we can get this like climate, what do people like young people call it, eco grief, right? Like they're kind of like overwhelmed almost to the point of inaction with like the sheer magnitude of all the challenges that we're facing. And so there is sort of this like, well, like screw it, like we've messed up the world so badly, we're not going to survive. And I admit that when I was younger, like I remember saying to my mother, maybe it's better if I don't have kids. Like I don't know what kind of world that I would be raising them in. And she got really angry with me because my brother had already started a family at that point. And she was like, you don't get to give up. Like you don't get to give up. And now that I'm a mother, of course I'm not going to give up. And I think about like what we're teaching our kids about the world. And you know, trying to balance some of the choices we make. We do a lot of travel. I do an insane amount of air travel as in my current role as moderator, but we travel a lot by air as a family when we can afford it. And for me, that's part of raising my kids to be global citizens. But there are many, many other ways that we don't consume as much as like probably the average Canadian family. We have a very small footprint in terms of the very, very small apartment we live in. We only have one car. It's fully electric. We say no to our kids about like 98% of the purchases that they would like to make.
Oh my God, that's too
So
adorable.
there are these like very like we cook at home a lot. We eat out more than we did before the pandemic, but then like we made Friday night takeout nights to try and help support local small restaurants. And eating takeout like once a week and building that into our budget so that we could make sure that like our neighbors were like could keep their businesses. And tried to spread the love, right? Like it wasn't only just our favorites. So I do think that as like the question of our age is like, how do we balance what we know and what we don't know about our future, and the tying it in with like the climate and the potential for these like battles and violence, because what we know about human history is that like the more scarce our resources are, the more likelihood there is for these armed conflicts too, right? So that's
Yeah.
an important theme we've raised. We only have a few minutes left, and I see Amy just raised their hand, so I'll let Amy ask a question or make a comment.
Hi, I'm Amy in Toronto.
Hello.
Lawrence Park Community Church, United Church. Just quickly to the moderator, saw you speak last June at Rosedale United. You were amazing. And also, I did attend this book club in the fall in October for the authors from The Wall Between. And the timing of it, of course, was incredible. And I learned so much. So I'm so grateful for this book club, Carmen. Thank you for doing this. And to tonight's author, I just wondered how influenced you were by the Hunger Games series. I'm sorry to bring that up. It like doesn't even compare to what you're doing. It's a different level. But even if you were like, okay, I'm not doing that. And then the other dystopian novel, you know, from my high school years is obviously The Handmaid's Tale, and which is still relevant today with what's happening with Roe versus Wade. And anyway, I just wondered how, like, when your writing process, do you try to block other dystopian novels out, or do you like accept them and bring them in and be like, okay, I have to like consider all of the totality of what's come before, and what am I going to build on, or what am I going to ignore and depart from? I'm just curious about your process.
Oh, what a wonderful question. Thank you. You sort of answered beautifully how I do it. It's what you just said. Yeah, I love the Hunger Games. Actually, I didn't read all the books, but I did see a good number of the movies. And The Handmaid's Tale, I think I had to study it for my BA in English Lit. And I can, you know, I used to have the last lines of it memorized. Where you don't quite know, is she going to step into the light or not? And then I think of the recently passed Alice Munro and her incredible writing. So the process is very much, and I actually get into that in the book. There's the front material and the end material. And I have a note to the reader where I talk about exactly that, where my practice is, and one of the reasons I chose the epic is to bring as much in as I can. So I have done a lot of reading. I mean, I love epic fantasy. And so it took me a while to realize, oh, that's what I'm writing. Because I really, in my off time, when I'm not writing and reading serious poetry, I was reading epic fantasy. And often it's young adult or, you know, YA fiction or whatever. So I'm very aware of it. And it is a kind of twofold push-pull thing where I bring in, I read, but then I also just have to create my own world. And it all goes in, right? It all factors in. people who don't read fantasy will often tell me, oh, you've got an oak box and you've got magic and you've got healers, you've got a wishing well. People who read epic fantasy, they never comment on it because it's just de rigueur. I have all the main elements that you would always encounter, and I maybe don't have a magic cloak or whatever, you know, or a wand, but similar things. So I think it's a dual process. It's like a dialectic where I'm both bringing in, and then at some point it feeds into what my imagination is doing, and then I just create my characters. Certainly, one of the things I was conscious of that was acting as a filter against were the sort of great white man who I love a lot of these writers, and I wanted to put myself in that pantheon. Don't strike me down, Muse. It can be hubris, but you know, in a way cognizant of skill and craft. So not just saying, oh, I'm going to be like, you know, Milton or Homer or whatever, but really wanting a brown hero who was flawed but good. And so that's Bramah, right? Yeah. Wonderful question. Thank you. I don't know if I answered it, hopefully.
So friends, we are at time. It's 8 o'clock Eastern time.
5
It's
here.
9 o'clock if you're on the East Coast, or 9:30 even if you're in Newfoundland. And it's time to probably wrap up and say goodnight for tonight. Thank you so much, Renee Sarajani, for this amazing work, and also for contextualizing it for us, and I think maybe breathing some life into it in a way that was hard on the first read, and I'll look forward to reading the next installments.
Wow, what a blessing. Thank you.
And just a reminder for everybody else, our next book club is the first official kickoff of our centennial year of the United Church of Canada, which our 100th year starts on June 10th, 2024, and we turn 100 on June 10th, 2025. June 27th is our next book club, and the Reverend Alf Dumont, a retired United Church minister who is Anishinaabe and settler heritage, who is now the elder in residence at BCIT, but is originally from Southern Ontario, is going to discuss his memoir, The Other Side of the River, about growing up Indigenous and going into ministry. And I think it touches a little bit on his experience of his, he went to Emmanuel College alongside his brother, Jim Dumont, and Jim left the church and became an elder in the Medewan Lodge, and he stayed in the church and became a minister. And so looking forward to having that be the start of our centennial series of our book club as we enter this 100th year. And I'll just put in a little plug for the centennial. There will be a national kickoff service that is happening from Metropolitan United Church on Sunday, June the 9th, so in a couple of weeks, 4 p.m. Eastern time, so it'll be 1 o'clock Pacific time, 5:30 in Newfoundland, 5 in Nova Scotia, on the East Coast. The General Secretary was going to preach, and now we have rearranged my schedule, and First on Eastern Edge's Celebration of Ministry service. Now I'm coming from Toronto to Toronto from St. John's to preach, so General Secretary will still play a big role in that service, obviously, but that the whole church is invited to attend, so you can find it on the social media page. There's save the dates, and I'm sure it'll be broadcast live on our YouTube channel. But I will also post the link for that service to kick off a commemoration of our first 100 years. And we've used the language of commemoration rather than celebration, realizing that our history is troubled and not perfect, and that there are legacies that we want to honor. And there are also things that we're still repenting and atoning for in the church. And so, and not just residential schools, homes for unwed mothers, and not ordaining deaconesses, and, all of the isms that have showed up in the church over the last 100 or 2,000 years. So anyway, I'll put that little plug in, and thanks again to everybody for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you so much, everyone. What an absolute honor. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Moderator Carmen.
Yeah.
You're amazing. You are amazing.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
awesome. It really kind of did breathe life into the book to hear her talk about it, hey?
Totally. And like hearing the poem read, like I read a few out loud to Devin because I was trying to just like, in some
Yeah.
ways it was just like, I don't get this. Does this make any sense to you? And it does. It's different out loud. So I thought that was fun
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. All right, my friend, it's 8 o'clock. I have not had supper.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go eat now.
Go eat, my friend. I got to eat too and run off to another meeting. So thanks
Oh, man.
again.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Yep.
Bye.
Ciao.
See you on Sunday. Well,
Yeah.
whenever it is, I see you.
Whatever
Okay.
it is. Yeah.
Bye.
Soonish. Ciao.
Bye.